The morning sun cast long shadows through the towering glass windows of Denver International Airport as Margaret Thompson made her way through the sliding doors, her silver hair neatly tucked beneath a powder blue knit cap. At 73, she had made this journey many times before, flying to Seattle to visit her grandchildren, but today felt different somehow. The airport was already buzzing with early morning activity. Business travelers rushed past with their briefcases, families herded sleepy children toward their gates, and airline staff in crisp uniforms navigated the crowd with practiced ease. Margaret took it all in with the patience that comes from decades of teaching third graders, reminding herself that she had planned everything perfectly, arriving 3 hours before her 10:30 a.m. flight. She had dressed carefully for the occasion in her favorite travel outfit, a warm cardigan over a floral blouse, comfortable navy slacks, and her trusty walking shoes. Her carry-on bag, covered in a cheerful pattern of pink and yellow roses, rolled smoothly behind her as she made her way toward the check-in counter. The bag itself was a birthday gift from her daughter last year, chosen specifically because it was light enough for Margaret to handle on her own. Inside her handbag, carefully packed alongside her wallet and reading glasses, was a special surprise for her grandchildren, her homemade bath salts, made from the recipe her husband Thomas had perfected over their 45 years of marriage. She smiled, thinking of how the kids loved watching the crystals dissolve in their bath, creating swirls of lavender-scented clouds in the water. As she joined the check-in line, Margaret chatted pleasantly with a young mother struggling to keep her toddler entertained. She offered the child a wrapped peppermint from her purse. She always carried them, a habit from her teaching days, and watched as the child's fussy expression melted into a smile. The mother mouthed a grateful thank you as Margaret waved off her thanks with a gentle hand. The check-in process went smoothly, and Margaret received her boarding pass with a sense of satisfaction. She had plenty of time to make her way through security and perhaps even enjoy a cup of tea at one of the terminal cafes before boarding. She could already picture her grandchildren's faces lighting up when they saw her at the arrival gate, just as they did every time she visited. As she wheeled her bag toward the security checkpoint, Margaret noticed how much airports had changed since her first flight decades ago. The modern terminals, with their soaring ceilings and endless rows of screens displaying departure times, were a far cry from the simple buildings she remembered from her youth. Still, she appreciated how helpful most of the staff were, always ready to point her in the right direction or offer assistance with her bags. She joined the security line, watching as passengers ahead of her efficiently removed their shoes and laptops, placed their belongings in gray plastic bins, and moved through the screening process. Margaret began preparing her own items, carefully placing her cardigan and shoes in one bin, her rolling bag in another. She kept her handbag for last, knowing she would need to show her ID and boarding pass again before proceeding through the scanner. Little did Margaret know that the contents of her handbag, the loving gift she had crafted for her grandchildren, would soon turn her routine journey into something entirely unexpected. As she waited patiently in line, surrounded by the usual sounds of airport announcements and rolling luggage, she had no idea that she was about to become the center of attention for every security officer in the terminal. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, catching the silver of her hair as she stepped forward, ready to place her final items in the security bin. In that moment, she was just another grandmother looking forward to hugging her grandchildren, unaware that her story would soon capture the attention of people far beyond the walls of Denver International Airport. The security line at Denver International Airport moved with the unhurried pace of a slow-moving stream that Thursday morning. Passengers shuffled forward in their socked feet, some balancing laptops and electronics, others trying to keep track of scattered belongings in multiple gray bins. The familiar beeping of metal detectors and murmur of instructions from TSA officers created a steady backdrop of airport white noise. Officer James Rodriguez had been working at this checkpoint for nearly 8 years, and he prided himself on staying alert even during these routine morning shifts. He sat at his screening station, eyes focused on the X-ray monitor as bags passed through in an endless parade of familiar shapes and densities. Laptops appeared as dark rectangles, phones as smaller shadows, and the usual assortment of keys and loose change scattered like metallic confetti across his screen. When Margaret's floral handbag entered the X-ray tunnel, Rodriguez was sipping his second cup of coffee of the morning. As the image materialized on his screen, his hand paused midway to his mouth. Years of training kicked in as his eyes locked onto an unusual density in the bottom corner of the bag. The object appeared as a crystalline mass, its edges irregular and its density unlike the usual items he encountered. Most concerning was the fact that it sat in what appeared to be an unmarked container. Following protocol, Rodriguez adjusted the image settings, rotating the view and enhancing the contrast. The more he examined the mysterious substance, the more certain he became that it required additional screening. He caught the eye of his colleague, Officer Chen, and gave a subtle nod, their practiced signal for needing assistance. Meanwhile, Margaret stood on the other side of the security checkpoint, adjusting her cardigan and sliding her feet back into her comfortable walking shoes. She had just retrieved her rolling carry-on when she noticed that her handbag hadn't emerged from the X-ray machine. A small line of bins had begun backing up behind it. Officer Rodriguez stepped away from his monitoring station, his movements calm but purposeful. He'd learned over the years that maintaining a peaceful atmosphere was crucial in these situations. Too much urgency could spark panic among other travelers, while too little could compromise security. He approached Margaret with a professional smile, his voice steady and courteous. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping over to our secondary screening area?" he asked, gesturing toward a separate section of the security checkpoint. "We need to take a closer look at your handbag." Margaret's expression shifted from confusion to concern. She glanced at the large digital clock on the wall. She still had plenty of time before her flight, but she couldn't help feeling a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Around them, other passengers continued through security, some casting curious glances in their direction before hurrying on toward their gates. 2 additional TSA agents approached, their blue uniforms crisp in the fluorescent lighting. Officer Lisa Thompson, a veteran agent with kind eyes and graying hair at her temples, took the lead in explaining the situation to Margaret. Her presence often helped ease tension in these situations, especially with elderly passengers. "We've noticed something in your bag that we need to examine more closely," Officer Thompson explained, her tone gentle but professional. "It's a routine procedure, and we'll try to make it as quick as possible. Would you please confirm that this is your property?" Margaret nodded, her hands clasped together as she watched Officer Rodriguez carefully remove her handbag from the X-ray belt. The weight of her boarding pass seemed to grow heavier in her pocket as she realized this delay might affect her carefully planned schedule. The secondary screening area was set slightly apart from the main security lanes, offering some privacy while maintaining clear sight lines for all security personnel. As Margaret followed the officers, she couldn't help but notice how the morning light streaming through the terminal's high windows cast long shadows across the floor. These same windows had seemed so cheerful just moments ago when she'd been admiring the airport's architecture. Other passengers continued to stream past, their own bags and belongings moving through security without incident. A businessman rushed past, phone pressed to his ear. A young couple helped each other gather their scattered belongings. A flight crew walked by in formation, their rolling bags clicking in perfect rhythm. All of them glimpsed the scene at the secondary screening area. An elderly woman standing with TSA officers before continuing on their way, perhaps saying silent thanks that it wasn't them facing a delay this morning. Margaret stood straight-backed beside the screening table, her teacher's posture automatic even in this stressful moment. As Officer Thompson began to explain the additional screening process, Margaret's mind wandered to the jar of bath salts in her bag, the special gift she had so carefully packed for her grandchildren. Could that be what had caught their attention? The thought seemed absurd, but as she watched the officers don blue gloves and prepare to search her bag, she realized her simple journey was about to become considerably more complicated. The security footage cameras silently recorded the scene as it unfolded, their digital eyes capturing every detail of what would soon become a memorable morning at Denver International Airport. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 7:42 a.m. as Officer Rodriguez led Margaret to the secondary screening area, her floral handbag now the center of attention. The small crowd of morning travelers parted around them like water around a stone, some slowing their pace just enough to catch a glimpse of what was happening. A mother hurried her curious children past, whispering something about not staring. An airline pilot paused briefly, his experienced eyes taking in the scene before continuing toward his gate. Margaret's confusion was evident in every movement as she followed the TSA officers. Her shoulders, usually held with the confident posture of a longtime teacher, had begun to droop slightly. She kept glancing at the large airport clock, mentally calculating the minutes until her flight was scheduled to depart. The thought of missing it, of her grandchildren waiting expectantly at the Seattle airport with no grandmother stepping off the plane, made her stomach tighten with worry. 2 additional TSA agents approached the screening area, their faces professionally neutral. Officer Chen, a thorough and experienced agent with 15 years of service, began explaining the process to Margaret. "We need to conduct a detailed inspection of your bag," he said, his voice calm and clear. "This may take some time, but we'll work as efficiently as possible. Can you tell me what you have packed in your handbag?" Margaret's voice wavered slightly as she responded, "Just my usual travel items, my wallet, reading glasses, some tissues, a few hard candies, and—" She paused, suddenly remembering, "Oh, and a jar of my homemade bath salts. They're a gift for my grandchildren." The mention of the bath salts caused the officers to exchange quick glances. Officer Thompson stepped forward, her manner gentle but firm. "Ma'am, could you tell us more about these bath salts? What exactly are they made of, and where did you get them?" As Margaret began explaining about her late husband's recipe and their 40-year tradition of making bath salts, security cameras captured the growing activity around the screening area. A supervisor had been called, and the distinctive blue uniforms of TSA personnel were becoming more concentrated in this corner of the security checkpoint. The overhead lights cast sharp shadows across the screening table as Officer Rodriguez carefully began removing items from Margaret's handbag. Each object was handled with precise care. A worn leather wallet, a paperback novel with a bookmark peeking out, a small packet of tissues, and finally, the mason jar in question. The jar sat innocently on the table, its contents catching the fluorescent light and sparkling like fresh snow. Margaret watched as her personal belongings were laid out for inspection, feeling oddly vulnerable. The jar of bath salts, which had brought such joy to her grandchildren over the years, now seemed somehow suspicious under the harsh airport lighting. She thought about all the times she and her husband had made these salts together in their kitchen, never imagining they would cause such concern. Other passengers continued to flow through the main security lanes, their own bags passing through X-ray machines without incident. Some cast sympathetic glances toward Margaret, perhaps sitting their own mothers or grandmothers in her situation. A young security officer, new to the job, stood nearby, ready to assist if needed, while trying to maintain a professional demeanor. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Margaret's flight time was drawing closer, and her anxiety began to show in the way she repeatedly smoothed her cardigan and checked the clock. Officer Thompson noticed her distress and tried to offer reassurance. "We understand this is difficult, ma'am, but we have to follow our security protocols. Would you like to sit down while we continue our inspection?" A chair was brought for Margaret, a small kindness that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation. From her seated position, she could see the normal flow of airport life continuing around her, families rushing to gates, business travelers checking phones, airport staff moving purposefully through the crowds. Yet here she sat, in this bubble of scrutiny, watching as more security personnel arrived to examine her simple jar of bath salts. The security cameras continued their silent recording as local law enforcement was notified. Their arrival would mark the next phase of what was becoming an increasingly complex situation. Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of missed connections and worried grandchildren heavy on her mind. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays streaming through the terminal windows and highlighting the concern on every face in the screening area. Little did anyone know that this incident would soon become a talking point in security briefings across the country, a reminder that even the most innocent-looking items could trigger important security protocols. For now, though, it was simply a grandmother, a jar of bath salts, and a growing number of security personnel, all captured by the unwavering eyes of airport surveillance cameras. The mason jar sat in the center of the screening table, its contents catching the morning light and throwing tiny rainbow reflections across the surface. Officer Thompson carefully lifted it, noting its weight and the way the crystals shifted inside. The jar itself was ordinary enough, the kind found in any home kitchen, with a simple metal lid that showed signs of frequent use, but it was what lay inside that had sparked this entire investigation. Margaret watched from her chair as the officers examined her handiwork. She remembered the previous evening, carefully measuring and mixing the ingredients just as she had done hundreds of times before. The recipe was second nature to her now. Epsom salts, baking soda, and just the right amount of essential oils, all carefully combined in her kitchen while thinking of her grandchildren's delighted faces. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, his voice professional but gentle, "could you explain exactly what's in this jar?" He held it up to the light, studying the way the crystals caught the fluorescent glow of the airport's overhead lighting. Around them, the usual bustle of airport traffic continued, though passengers now gave their corner a wider berth. Margaret sat up straighter, her teacher's instinct kicking in as she prepared to explain. "Those are my homemade bath salts," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "My husband and I started making them together back in 1980. He was a high school chemistry teacher, you see, and he loved experimenting with different combinations until he found the perfect recipe." As she spoke, her eyes grew misty with memory. "We used to make them together every Sunday afternoon. After he passed away 5 years ago, I kept up the tradition. The grandchildren love them. They say the lavender scent helps them sleep better." She paused, watching as Officer Chen made notes on his clipboard. "I've been bringing them on every visit since the kids were tiny. This is the first time there's ever been any problem." The officers exchanged glances. The story sounded sincere, but protocol demanded thorough investigation. A younger officer carefully photographed the jar from multiple angles, while another began the process of documenting its exact weight and dimensions. The crystals inside sparkled innocently, their white surface occasionally revealing hints of purple from the lavender oil. Margaret's flight time was drawing closer, and she could feel each minute ticking away like a physical weight on her shoulders. She thought of her daughter waiting at the Seattle airport, probably already wondering why her mother hadn't called to say she'd made it through security. Her cell phone sat untouched in her purse. Airport security had asked her not to use it during the investigation. A few feet away, a family hurried past with rolling suitcases, the parents hustling their children along while trying not to stare. One small boy turned his head to look, reminding Margaret of her own grandson. She had planned to use these bath salts in his bedtime bath tonight, just like always. Now she wondered if she'd make it to Seattle at all today. Officer Thompson approached with a small testing kit, the kind used to identify unknown substances. "We're going to need to take a small sample for analysis," she explained, her tone apologetic but firm. "It's standard procedure when we encounter any crystalline substance we can't immediately identify." Margaret nodded, watching as they carefully opened the jar. The familiar scent of lavender wafted out, bringing with it memories of countless bath times with her grandchildren, of her husband carefully measuring ingredients in their sunny kitchen, of peaceful Sunday afternoons spent mixing and bottling their special creation. The younger officer's eyes widened slightly at the strength of the lavender scent, and Margaret noticed a slight softening in Officer Thompson's expression. The aroma seemed to humanize the situation somehow, making it harder to view the contents as potentially dangerous. Still, they proceeded with their testing, carefully removing a small amount of the crystals with a sterile tool. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as they worked. Margaret could see her fellow travelers passing by, some rushing to catch flights, others leisurely making their way to their gates. She thought about how different her morning had turned out from what she planned. Instead of being halfway to her gate by now, sipping tea and reading her book, she sat watching strangers examine her beloved bath salts as if they were something dangerous. The jar caught the light again, sending another spray of tiny rainbows across the screening table. Margaret remembered how her grandson called them magic crystals because of the way they sparkled and dissolved in the bath. She wished she could make these officers understand that this jar contained nothing more dangerous than love, a grandmother's love, carefully measured and mixed, meant to bring comfort and joy to her family. As the testing process continued, Margaret noticed more security personnel arriving. She recognized the uniforms of local law enforcement joining the TSA officers. Her simple jar of bath salts had somehow become the center of an ever-growing investigation, and she couldn't help but wonder how such a beloved family tradition had turned into such a serious security concern. The next hour unfolded in slow motion under the watchful eyes of the airport's security cameras. The digital clock on the wall showed 8:45 a.m. as a TSA supervisor made his way through the terminal, his polished shoes clicking against the floor tiles. Behind him walked two local police officers, their presence drawing curious glances from passing travelers. Margaret sat quietly in her chair, watching as her jar of bath salts became the focus of an increasingly complex investigation. The supervisor, a tall man with graying temples and reading glasses perched on his nose, introduced himself as Mr. Phillips. His voice was kind but carried the weight of authority that came with 20 years of airport security experience. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, consulting the paperwork in his hands, "I understand these are homemade bath salts." He gestured toward the mason jar, which now sat in the center of a cleared space on the screening table. The morning sun streaming through the terminal windows made the crystals inside sparkle like fresh snow. Margaret nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, sir. My husband and I perfected the recipe years ago. I've been making them the same way ever since." She watched as one of the officers donned protective gloves, preparing to conduct more detailed testing. The sight made her heart sink. Her special gift for her grandchildren was being treated like something dangerous. Around them, the airport continued its morning rush. Announcements echoed through the terminal. Final boarding call for Flight 372 to Chicago. Margaret's own flight time had come and gone, but that seemed less important now as she watched the officers work. She thought of her daughter, probably already waiting at the Seattle airport, wondering why she hadn't called. The testing process was methodical and precise. Officer Thompson stood nearby, occasionally offering Margaret reassuring smiles. The protective gear the officers wore seemed excessive for bath salts, but protocol demanded thorough safety measures. Their movements were careful and deliberate as they worked, documenting every step with photographs and notes. The substance appears crystalline in nature, one officer dictated into a recorder with a strong lavender scent. He paused, making a note on his clipboard. "Container is a standard mason jar, approximately 16 ounces in capacity." The formal language made Margaret's simple bath salts sound like evidence in a crime drama. A young family hurried past, their rolling suitcases creating a rhythm against the floor tiles. The smallest child, a girl about the age of Margaret's granddaughter, stared wide-eyed at the officers in their protective gear. Her mother quickly pulled her along, whispering something about not being late for their flight. The clock ticked steadily onward. Margaret's carefully planned schedule had completely unraveled, yet she found herself thinking more about her grandchildren than her missed flight. Would they understand why she hadn't arrived? Would they be disappointed? She pictured their faces, usually so bright with excitement when she visited, now clouded with confusion and worry. Mr. Phillips approached again, his clipboard tucked under his arm. "Mrs. Thompson, we're going to need to run one more series of tests. I understand this is taking longer than anyone expected, but I want to assure you we're working as quickly as we can while following all necessary security protocols." Margaret nodded, smoothing her cardigan with slightly trembling hands. The morning had grown warm, and the terminal's air conditioning couldn't quite keep up with the increasing crowd of travelers. She watched as another officer carefully measured a small sample of the bath salts into a testing kit. The security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing every detail of the scene. The officers in their protective gear, the curious glances from passing travelers, the jar of bath salts sitting innocently in the center of it all, and Margaret, waiting with the patience of a grandmother who had raised 3 children and taught hundreds more. A maintenance worker passed by, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. He slowed briefly, taking in the scene with raised eyebrows before continuing on his way. Margaret wondered what he thought of it all, an elderly woman surrounded by security personnel, all because of some homemade bath salts she'd wanted to share with her grandchildren. Officer Thompson approached with a paper cup of water. "Thought you might be thirsty," she said softly, her eyes kind behind her professional demeanor. Margaret accepted the cup gratefully, realizing she hadn't had anything to drink since her morning coffee at home. Such a simple gesture of kindness nearly brought tears to her eyes. Time continued its slow march forward as the investigation proceeded. Each test seemed to lead to another. Each form filled out required additional documentation. Margaret's shoulders began to slump with fatigue, but she maintained her composure, answering every question clearly and patiently. Her years as a teacher had taught her the value of staying calm in challenging situations. The morning light had shifted, casting different shadows across the terminal floor. Margaret watched as her fellow travelers rushed past, each caught up in their own journeys, their own stories. She wondered how many of them would go home tonight and tell their families about the strange scene they'd witnessed at the airport, the elderly woman, the security officers, and the mysterious jar that had caused such a commotion. The late morning sun had reached its full strength, streaming through the terminal windows and warming the screening area where Margaret had spent the last 2 hours. The clock showed 10:15 a.m. Her original flight was now somewhere over the Rocky Mountains without her. But at last there was movement among the security team that suggested the long ordeal might be reaching its conclusion. Officer Thompson approached Margaret, holding a clipboard and wearing what appeared to be the first genuine smile of the morning. Behind her, other officers were carefully removing their protective gear, their movements more relaxed than they had been earlier. The tension that had filled the air began to dissolve like one of Margaret's bath salts in warm water. "Mrs. Thompson," Officer Thompson began, her voice warm with relief, "I'm happy to tell you that our testing is complete. The substance in your jar is exactly what you said it was, bath salts, nothing more." She paused, allowing the news to sink in. "The mixture of Epsom salts, baking soda, and essential oils matched your description perfectly." Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time since the ordeal began, and she felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. A small crowd of security personnel had gathered nearby, their faces showing a mixture of relief and something that looked like embarrassment. Mr. Phillips, the supervisor, stepped forward. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to personally apologize for the inconvenience this has caused you." He gestured toward the window where her flight should have been. "Unfortunately, your original flight has departed, but I want to assure you we're already working on solving that problem." The security cameras captured the scene as officers began carefully repacking Margaret's belongings. The jar of bath salts, now officially cleared, was wrapped in a soft cloth before being placed back in her handbag. Officer Rodriguez, who had first spotted the suspicious substance on his X-ray screen, approached with Margaret's rolling suitcase. "You know," he said, a slight smile crossing his face, "my own grandmother used to make something similar. The lavender scent, it reminded me of her house when I was a kid." His admission seemed to break down the last barriers of formality, and several other officers nodded in recognition of similar memories. A young airport staff member hurried over with a bottle of water and a voucher for the airport cafe. "You must be hungry," she said kindly, helping Margaret gather her things. "This can be used at any restaurant in the terminal while we sort out your new flight arrangements." Margaret accepted the voucher gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since her early breakfast at home. The thought of food reminded her of the lunch she had packed for the flight. A sandwich and cookies that now seemed like they belonged to a different day entirely. Around them, the regular flow of airport traffic continued. New passengers were making their way through security, some glancing curiously at the group gathered around Margaret. The scene that had caused such concern earlier was transforming into something almost celebratory, as if everyone involved needed to make up for the stress of the previous hours. Officer Thompson helped Margaret stand, steadying her as she got to her feet after sitting for so long. "A customer service representative is waiting to help you with rebooking," she explained. "We've already contacted the airlines, and they're aware of the situation. They'll get you to Seattle as soon as possible." Margaret nodded, but her mind was already on her next challenge. "I should call my daughter," she said, reaching for her phone. "She's probably worried sick by now." The thought of her family waiting anxiously in Seattle made her heart ache. The younger security officer who had brought the water stepped forward again. "We've arranged for you to use the airline's private lounge while you wait for your new flight," she said. "It's quiet in there, and you'll be able to make your calls in comfort." This thoughtful gesture brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. As she gathered her belongings, several of the officers who had been involved in the investigation came to apologize personally. Their faces showed genuine regret for the inconvenience, even as they explained that they had been following necessary security protocols. Margaret, with the grace of a longtime teacher, accepted each apology with a gentle smile. "You were all just doing your jobs," she said, adjusting her cardigan. "And you know what? My grandchildren are going to love this story, especially the part about their grandmother's bath salts causing such excitement." Her ability to find humor in the situation seemed to lift a weight from the officer's shoulders. The security footage captured this final scene. An elderly woman surrounded by airport personnel, all smiling now as she prepared to continue her journey. The jar of bath salts, once the source of so much concern, was safely tucked away in her handbag, ready to fulfill its intended purpose of bringing joy to her grandchildren, even if a little later than planned. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Denver International Airport as Margaret finally settled into her seat on the 2:30 p.m. flight to Seattle. The airline had worked quickly to rebook her, upgrading her to first class as a gesture of goodwill after the morning's events. Her famous jar of bath salts was safely stowed in her handbag under the seat in front of her, having passed its second security screening without incident. The story of her unusual morning had spread quickly through the airport staff. As she made her way to her new gate, several employees had stopped to check on her, offering kind words and apologetic smiles. One flight attendant even recognized her as the bath salts grandmother and made sure she had an extra pillow for the flight. Earlier, in the airline's private lounge, Margaret had finally been able to call her daughter. The conversation had started with worried questions, but had ended in laughter as Margaret recounted the details of her security adventure. "You won't believe what happened to Mom at the airport," she had heard her daughter telling the grandchildren in the background, followed by excited chatter and questions. The incident had already begun to transform into something larger than just a security delay. During her wait in the lounge, Margaret had noticed a TSA supervisor leading a training session nearby, using her case as an example of balancing thorough security protocols with compassionate treatment of elderly passengers. She overheard phrases like maintaining dignity and communication skills and felt a small sense of pride that her experience might help improve things for future travelers. Body camera footage from the responding officers had captured every detail of the investigation, from the initial discovery to the final resolution. The recordings showed not just the technical aspects of security procedures, but also the human side, the small kindnesses offered by officers, the patience displayed by both sides, and the way a potentially tense situation had been handled with grace and understanding. A young mother in the next seat smiled at Margaret as the plane began its taxi to the runway. "I heard about what happened this morning," she said softly. "My mother makes homemade soap, and I'm always worried about traveling with it." This led to a pleasant conversation about family traditions and the unexpected complications of modern air travel. The flight attendant doing final checks paused at their row. "Would you like a cup of tea, Mrs. Thompson?" she offered. "I heard you had quite a morning." Word had obviously spread through the airline staff, and Margaret found herself touched by how many people seemed concerned about her well-being. As the plane lifted off, Margaret thought about how this story would become part of her family's history. The time Grandma's bath salts caused a security alert at the airport. Her grandchildren would probably ask her to tell it again and again, each time delighting in the details about the officers in their protective gear, treating her simple homemade gift like something from a spy movie. The incident had already made its way onto social media, thanks to her granddaughter's quick thinking. "Mom, you're trending." Her daughter had laughed during their phone call. The story had struck a chord with people, perhaps because it highlighted both the seriousness of airport security and the importance of handling such situations with humanity and respect. Airport administration had taken note as well. By the time Margaret boarded her new flight, plans were already in motion to review and update guidelines for screening homemade personal care items. Her experience would be used to help develop more efficient protocols that maintain security while better accommodating elderly passengers and their personal items. The whole event had sparked interesting discussions among aviation security experts. Some pointed out how the incident demonstrated the effectiveness of existing protocols, while others saw it as an opportunity to refine screening procedures for common homemade items. Margaret's bath salts had inadvertently become a case study in modern airport security. Looking out the window at the clouds below, Margaret smiled as she imagined the scene that would greet her at the Seattle airport. Her grandchildren would be there, bouncing with excitement not just to see their grandmother, but also to hear firsthand about her unexpected adventure. The jar of bath salts in her bag had taken on a new significance, no longer just a simple family tradition, but now a story of patience, understanding, and the importance of maintaining humanity in an age of necessary security. The late afternoon light streamed through the airplane window, reminding Margaret of how the morning sun had sparkled on her crystal bath salts during their thorough examination. She took out her crossword puzzle, finally able to relax as the plane carried her toward her family. Sometimes, she reflected, the most memorable stories come from the most unexpected situations, and she had a feeling this one would be told in her family for years to come.